Hello again, it's me. I have an older painting that I started with for like 3 years ago, which I took a video of, and I'm gonna show you. It's a sketch. I'm gonna post the first video from sketch to from start to sketch, where you can see how I build the colors. It is actually from New York. The model I had is working in the, among other things, in the burlesque community in New York, and I had a photo shoot of her in the Marriott on Times Square, a nice hotel. So I used it as a photo studio. She had the most amazing tattoos, and she's really beautiful girl. Her professional name or business name is Sincerely Yours, so you can probably look her up. Yeah, and I'm gonna now start to paint this from this point of, you see the colors, how I have built the sketch. And the thing is that it's gonna be amazing to work with all these pillows and all these colors in her tattoos. And she has a bassoon. She plays the bassoon, the lace there in front of her. And she has a very nice face, a classical, beautiful face. So, well, it's going to be, this is one of a bunch of paintings I'm going to do called the Marriott series. And it's going to be part of a big exhibition I'm going to make, just called New York. So it's going to be from the city and from models from the burlesque scene, basically from New York City. So this is one of them. I'm doing right now 2 others also. I might make videos of them as well. They're already finished sketches. So I don't know why I stopped working with it. I think it's because I had so many other things to do, like commission work and small exhibitions, and this kind of just put it off. And it's a very stupid thing to do, because it seems like you loose ends is not good. You should, if you start on a painting, try to finish it. You finish it and you put it away, and you have it to an exhibition or something. So anyway, the sound, I'm not talking in this video for once. Maybe you're sick of hearing me talk. I play some short art documentaries about different artists, different painters in the background. If you see in description, I will put in description who it is, and you can also hear on the soundbite which artist they are talking about. So anyway, thanks for watching, and remember to share and subscribe. And if you find my channel interesting and helpful, you can also donate. There's a donate button up there. Also a button to Patreon. I'm going to try building up my Patreon page. And yeah, so if you want to give something back, just do it. Everything is appreciated. Leave a comment, share, and stay tuned for file number.
Of all the great artists, Caravaggio seems to speak most intensely to the modern world. A man whose art seems obsessed with sexuality and sensuality, youth and beauty, fear and violence, loneliness and intense self-awareness. He lived a brief and tumultuous life, mocking authority, even murdering a man. He spent 4 years on the run, a fugitive from justice, but he always painted, reimagining the most familiar stories in Western culture from the Bible, and bringing religious art to life in paintings so powerful and naturalistic that some saw them as miracles in themselves. Caravaggio was born, it's believed, in September 1571 here in Milan. He was christened Michelangelo Merisi, but later adopted the name Caravaggio from the village in which his father owned property, 43 kilometres east of Milan. His father died of the plague when Caravaggio was a young boy, and soon after he became an apprentice to painter Simone Peterzano. When he just turned 20, Caravaggio sold the land he'd inherited from his father and left Milan and the north for good. There are various unsubstantiated reports that he'd spent time in prison in Milan for assaulting a constable, the first in a number of crimes with which Caravaggio was implicated throughout his mysterious life. What's more certain, though, is that when he headed south, he came to the city in which he would make his artistic name, Rome. By the late 16th century, Rome had fallen from grace, lagging far behind Venice, Naples, Florence and Milan. But the Pope, Sixtus V, was seeking to reverse this, and the city was busy with building projects. Caravaggio's early years, however, seem to have been spent in various households and workshops, carrying out menial artistic tasks. One of these workshops was that of Giuseppe Cesare d'Arpino, the foremost Roman painter of the day. But the precocious Caravaggio made clear his disregard for the reverence shown to ancient statues and to the art of the Renaissance masters, particularly Michelangelo and Raphael. One day, it's said, when shown some ancient sculptures, Caravaggio pointed instead to a crowd of people in the street, declaring them to be superior models for his art. And it's this proclaimed interest in naturalism that's made evident in two paintings widely believed to be done by Caravaggio while he's still working for Cesare d'Arpino, the first of which takes a young fruit seller off the street. There's a dreamy expression on his face, and he's sensually delighting in the succulent basket of fruit that he clasped to himself. The picture's slightly staged with this raking diagonal lighting that becomes a trademark of Caravaggio's later work. But look at how the work's painted. It's beautiful, dexterous. And it's an exquisitely painted still life of grapes and peaches that arrests the viewer's eye and then draws us into this, the second picture, which is clearly alluding to the Roman god of wine and inspiration, Bacchus. But it's also a self-portrait, and a self-portrait with a twist. Because if you look at those greying lips and those sunken dark eyes, this is an image of Bacchus and Caravaggio that's ill or sick. And I think it's subversive. I think what he's saying is that ancient or classical Roman culture is sick, and perhaps the future is in naturalism. Look at the grapes, how they're painted. They are naturalistic, but at the same time they're turning, which amplifies that idea of illness. The expression on his face is melancholic, and melancholia, in Renaissance and post-Renaissance Italy, is associated with the creative genius. And when you combine that with this crown that he wears on his head, it's as if he's saying, I've arrived. The painting which caught the eye of the Roman art world and announced the dramatic arrival of a new talent was this one, called The Card Sharps. It's a piece of theatre on canvas, a slightly comic moral fable about the gullibility of youth, with a raffishly clothed man and his young accomplice fleecing a young aristocrat at cards. The man peering not so surreptitiously at his hand and gesturing to his sidekick, who reaches for the winning card behind his back. Caravaggio uses the same model for both boys, both practical and perhaps a reference to the potential duality in each of us. Sometime in 1595, the card sharps caught the eye of Cardinal Francesco Maria del Monte, the Medici ambassador to the papal court here in Rome, who lived in the splendid Palazzo Madama just round the corner from the Piazza Navona. And so impressed was the cardinal with Caravaggio's work that he asked the painter to join his household. Whilst Caravaggio was in Del Monte's service, he was commissioned to paint 5 major pictures, the most lyrical and sensual of which was this one. The musicians shows a lute player, a singer and a cornetto player preparing to make music whilst a winged cupid plucks at a bunch of grapes. It's a hedonistic image which builds on Caravaggio's early paintings, but also tries to convey something of the power of music. The boy with the lute has tears in his eyes, as if moved by the sounds around him, and the almost orgasmic look on the face of the cornetto player just behind adds a haunting and erotic dimension to the painting. This may be a self-portrait of the painter, partly angelic, partly mischievous, and with trouble just around the corner. In 1598, Caravaggio was arrested and thrown in prison for illegally carrying a sword, but he was quickly released because he was in the employment of the influential Cardinal Del Monte. Subsequently, Del Monte was instrumental in Caravaggio winning an important commission, conveniently enough located slap bang next to where Caravaggio was living at the Palazzo Madama. It was for a pair of paintings to be produced for the Contarelli Chapel in this church of San Luigi dei Franchesi. The commission, both physically and in terms of importance, was by far and away the biggest of Caravaggio's career to date. It came from a French cardinal, Contarelli, who's buried here in the chapel, whose will decreed that he wanted 2 scenes from the life of St Matthew the Evangelist depicted on his chapel walls. And it's a kind of narrative sequence that Caravaggio produced, which begins with this picture, the calling of St Matthew. Matthew was a tax collector and a publican, a wealthy man, who is confronted by Christ in the tax office, where Christ sees him and says, "Follow me." And it's exactly that moment that Caravaggio tries to bring to life. In a way, it's a picture of 2 halves, with Christ and St Peter on the right-hand side, dressed in biblical costume. Christ points at St Matthew and the viewer's eye is drawn from right to left, and look at the way the light rakes in from the window, illuminating the bearded face of St Matthew, who points at himself as if to say, "Me?" St Matthew and his wealthy and slightly loose friends are clad in contemporary Roman costume. And this is part of the power of the painting. It's as if these figures have stepped from out of the Roman back streets and into a bar, although in this case it's a tax office. But actually, it looks almost like a gambling den. There's something evocative of Caravaggio's painting of the card sharps, where one figure is looking down at money, St Matthew has a coin tucked into his hat, as if to amplify their value system. Ultimately, it's a painting of contrast between poverty and wealth, darkness and light, with St Matthew divinely illuminated. It also contrasts the Roman world in which Caravaggio lived with the biblical one that he wanted to bring to life. It's a simple story, but told in a complex or sophisticated way. And from this, Caravaggio turns his attention to something equally dramatic, but much more garishly violent. This work, The Martyrdom of St Matthew, was actually begun by Caravaggio before he started work on The Calling. But having finished that work, he came back to this and realised it didn't have quite the impact, and also the figures were too small. So he reworked it, he scaled everything up, and this is the finished piece. According to legend, Matthew was preaching the Christian gospel that he'd actually written or recorded in Ethiopia. And he came across the fiancée of King Hyrtacus, a woman called Iphigenia, and he converted her to Christianity, and in turn, she wouldn't marry the king. He then sent an assassin to slay Matthew, and that's the moment that Caravaggio chooses to depict. And in the narrative, St Matthew is in church saying Mass, but he's also baptising these figures, one of whom rears up to kill him. Look at the light of the painting. Rather like The Calling, it comes in from the top left-hand side of the painting. We know that in his studio, Caravaggio hung a strong lamp to get this theatrical effect. Also, the figures, who seem to have been taken directly from The Calling of St Matthew, are wearing contemporary clothes, as is the priest. And this would have struck a chord with the contemporary Roman audience, because a few years before in Rome, a Protestant fanatic attacked a priest just at the moment he was holding up the host, and eventually was bundled off to prison. So it played on contemporary phobias. There are 2 other key details. The first, the figure of the angel, who holds a palm leaf down to St Matthew as if to proclaim that redemption and eternal life will be his. The other one, though, is more subtle. In the distance, as if fleeing from the scene, wearing a robe, looking over his shoulder, is Caravaggio. There's a self-portrait. And this desire he has for authenticity, trying to make things seem as lifelike as possible, is amplified with that gesture. He's trying to immerse himself in the scene and, in effect, paint it from the inside out. But as Caravaggio's creative life got more successful, his private life seemed to get darker and became a kind of low-life opera, a combination of back streets and brothels, of fights, and eventually of murder. In 1600, Caravaggio was commissioned by the Pope's Treasurer General, a man called Tiberio Cerasi, to produce work for his funerary chapel here in this church of Santa Maria del Popolo, on the northern edge of the city. Then is now a busy place where pilgrims flocked to a city that was reawakening itself spiritually. And in order to make the work as powerful as possible, the Treasurer General chose the two rising stars of Roman art to do the commission, Annibale Carracci and of course Caravaggio. And effectively, the two painters went head to head inside the church. In a way, Annibale Carracci has a head start because he gets the central commission to paint the altarpiece, and this is his version of the Assumption of the Virgin Mary. Now his style of art, we may say, is classical Baroque, that style that is used to promote Roman Catholicism, where forms are idealised, simplified to a certain extent, using light and drama. But then, flanking them, and in contrast, is Caravaggio, whose paintings are much darker, much murkier, but also equally dramatic, but using intense realism, working directly from the model to try and bring Christianity and Roman Catholicism to life. And the two subjects that Caravaggio chooses are very close to the city of Rome. One is the martyrdom of St. Peter, which took place here in Rome. The other is the conversion of St. Paul. And there's a real nice twist as to what Caravaggio thinks of Carracci in this battle as they go head to head. Because in the conversion of St. Paul, there's a giant horse whose backside points unmistakably straight at Carracci's work. And then on the opposite wall, there's a similar treatment to a different subject, this time the martyrdom or crucifixion of St. Peter, where once again the image is cropped. We zoom in. We don't see the background detail of the crowds that gathered for the execution of St. Peter, but what we do see is a contemporary Roman workman who's just dug the hole in which the cross will be placed, and then his dirty feet, and this idea of him about to lift the cross up, where above a man tugs. And of course St. Peter is executed upside down. That's his choice, because he doesn't want exactly to mirror the suffering of his Saviour, of Christ. And the picture has this amazing sense of uncoiling. It's this idea of moving upwards and round. There's a sense of what's going to happen next. It's a wonderful frozen moment. And once again, the detail and the symbolism is absolutely charged. In the foreground is a rock. Why? Well, St. Peter is the rock on which the church was built. And the effect of the painting is not to show St. Peter as, if you like, the forerunner of papal splendour, but it locates him once again as a fisherman who was found by Christ and who then followed him. It's a much humbler image of St. Peter than we usually get.
But Caravaggio's personal life was less humble and less dignified, and his fiery temper was frequently getting him into trouble. In one instance, a fellow painter called Baglioni accused Caravaggio of libel for writing and circulating scurrilous verses, virulently denigrating Baglioni's art. Caravaggio was duly found guilty and spent 2 weeks in jail.
In spite of his growing notoriety, Caravaggio got the big commission in 1605 to produce an altarpiece for the old Basilica of St. Peter's in Rome.
Because the church was being rebuilt, Caravaggio's work only hung in the Vatican for a few days, but it was more than long enough to provoke discussion.
The subject matter shows the Virgin Mary and Christ stamping on the head of the serpent, the sign or symbol of the original sin. And there's a rather interesting and slightly comical theological debate that had raged through the 16th century, with the Protestants saying it was Jesus who stamped on the serpent's head, and the Catholics saying it was Mary, and a papal bull in 1569 from the Pope proclaimed that in fact it was Mary with Jesus' help. And that's what Caravaggio shows. And he also adds Mary's mother to the scene, St. Anne. And you get this wonderful contrast of age, of the young beautiful woman and the aging woman. On the evening of the 28th of May, 1606, the Roman sky was illuminated with a firework display to celebrate the first anniversary of the crowning of the Pope. But what went down in history that night had nothing to do with the papacy, because Caravaggio ended up killing a man called Nuccio Tomasoni. Some people have speculated it was a fight over something as mundane as a tennis match, but we do know that the two of them had quarrelled a few days earlier, and that Tomasoni was a high-class pimp of sorts, one of whose girls, or prostitutes, was sometimes used as a model by Caravaggio, so perhaps it was a quarrel over a girl. Anyway, Tomasoni was definitely killed by Caravaggio's sword, and the story spread through newspapers and the Roman grapevine like wildfire, so much so that a capital sentence was passed on Caravaggio, which meant that anyone bringing him, dead or alive, his body or simply his head, to justice would receive a reward. And so, not surprisingly, the painter very quickly decided to leave town. And he came here, to Naples, a city not under direct papal control, and a city known to have harboured the odd fugitive from Roman justice. One of the numerous churches built in Naples at the beginning of the 17th century was this one, the Madonna della Misericordia, built by 7 young noblemen as part of an institution that included a hospital to tend the sick. The church itself was built between 1602 and 1606, and all that was needed was an altarpiece. And it just so happened that the most celebrated Italian painter of the day was in the city, and so Caravaggio got the commission. This is a rare example where the chaos off the street is transformed into a vision on the wall in a church, in a painting that's complicated, chaotic and pulsating. It's called either the Madonna della Misericordia, or the Madonna of Mercy, or the 7 Acts of Mercy. At the top is the Madonna and Child presiding over everything, with an angel who gestures down to this vision on earth, but actually it's a vision taken from the back streets of Naples. The 7 noblemen who'd established this place wanted to practice the 7 Acts of Mercy, which, according to St Matthew, were giving food to the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, clothing the naked, visiting and tending the sick, visiting those in prison, taking in strangers and giving succour to pilgrims, and, this was added in the Middle Ages, burying the dead. And all of those ideas, all of those acts, are incorporated by Caravaggio in the scene below. Nearest to us, there's a crippled beggar who is naked. Above him, and clad in the luxurious outfit of a contemporary Neapolitan nobleman, is a man who's about to give his cape to the man. To his right, there's a pudgy-looking face, chubby hands, of someone who's been identified as a Neapolitan innkeeper. Behind them, you can see a figure carrying a dead body, illuminated by a man with a candle. And most curiously of all, there's this young girl who offers her breast to an old man who's clearly in prison. Now, the origins of this story go back to Roman literature, to a story of charity involving an old man called Simon, who is starving in prison and who in the end is visited by his daughter, who offers a father her milk. And that is amazingly depicted by Caravaggio, right down to the detail of droplets of milk on the old man's beard. It's a highly unnerving image, certainly to our eyes, but it also symbolises an extraordinary act of charity. But I think salvation is a long way off in this picture. It seems to me a painting charged with fear and proclaiming the idea that death can strike at any minute, which, if we think about Caravaggio's circumstances, with a death threat hanging over him, I think it makes it a very personal painting. But nevertheless, it's one that established his reputation in the Neapolitan art world. Numerous commissions came as a result of this work, and also amongst younger Neapolitan painters, some of whom actually produced work in this church. Caravaggio's direct influence was immense.
In spite of a growing success in Naples, he was no nearer gaining a papal pardon, and so Caravaggio travelled to Malta to seek the help of the Knights of St John. There he painted an impressive full-length portrait of the Grand Master, the French nobleman Alof de Vignacourt. This so impressed de Vignacourt that he secured the Pope's approval for Caravaggio to become a Knight of St John, as well as strong hints from the papacy that it might offer clemency to the artist.
Just when everything seemed to be going well again in Caravaggio's life, surprisingly, there was a problem. He was imprisoned. We don't exactly know why. The suspicion is that he had a fight with another knight. What we do know, though, is that he was incarcerated in the castle dungeon, and then, presumably with the help of powerful friends, he managed to escape, scale down the walls into a boat at the bottom, and then headed out to sea. From Malta, Caravaggio headed to Sicily, under Spanish jurisdiction, but still close enough to Malta for Caravaggio to feel threatened by the knights. And accounts of his year on the island say that he became increasingly crazy and deranged, often sleeping fully clothed and with a dagger under his pillow, a fugitive on the run.
Partly out of a need to earn a living, and perhaps partly out of a moral or religious compulsion, Caravaggio completed a number of commissions for Sicilian patrons, including the raising of Lazarus for the Order of the Ministers of the Sick in Messina. The work is typical of Caravaggio's late style, with an almost overwhelming darkness. And although there may be a danger of over-reading what is a conventional subject for Christian art, the idea of painting an image of Lazarus, the man who came back from the dead,
must have had a strong resonance for the artist. In October 1609, Caravaggio fled Sicily, presumably because his various pursuers, he felt, were about to catch up with him, and he returned here to Naples. But almost immediately he was beaten up and left for dead. So he moved to the edge of the city, to the home of the Colonna family, where his lifelong protector, the Marchese de Caravaggio, was in town on business, but also beginning to broker a deal with the Pope to pardon the painter. Caravaggio's desire for a pardon is oddly enough evident in this work, which shows David with the head of Goliath. It's a dark work in every sense. The young boy, having killed the giant with his slingshot and then cut his head off, is shown holding the head with the hair visible through the fingers and blood dripping down, seemingly off the edge of the canvas. But what gives this work a real twist is the fact that Goliath is deemed to be a self-portrait by Caravaggio. So how does all this fit together? Well, remember, Caravaggio has had a death sentence metaphorically hanging over his own head for the previous 4 years, and the theory is that this work was painted in order to placate a former patron, Scipione Borghese, who is the Pope's nephew. And what in effect Caravaggio is saying is, I've sinned, my crime is horrendous, but rather than decapitate me literally, I give you my painted head in the hope that in the end, mercy will prevail. It seems that mercy was about to prevail, because in July 1610, Caravaggio was on his way back to Rome by boat, when it stopped just down the coast at Paolo. Here though, as was so often the case in his life, events become shrouded in mystery. Caravaggio was arrested, perhaps even mistakenly, because he was released 2 days later, by which time the boat had continued northward with his paintings and possessions on board. Caravaggio pursued the boat as far as Porto Ercole, where it seems he died of a fever, maybe malaria, at the age of 38. His death went unrecorded, and there is no known place of burial. His death has fueled conspiracy theorists ever since, with everyone from the Knights of Malta to forerunners of the Sicilian mafia deemed responsible. The truth is probably an act of the god whom he venerated and feared in many of his greatest paintings. There may be no trace of Caravaggio's actual body, but he left a body of work that has had perhaps more influence on Western painting over the last 400 years than any other single artist. Francesca has been seen as one of the mystery men of Western art, a painter of enigmatic images rendered with mathematical precision and monumental vision, but which are often strange and elusive, haunting even. He was overlooked for centuries and subsequently was seen as a precursor to the achievements of Leonardo, Michelangelo and Raphael. But he's now recognised as their equal. Piero della Francesca was born around 1413 here in the town of what was then called Borgo San Sepolcro, now just San Sepolcro, then as now a thriving commercial centre on the Umbrian-Tuscan borders. His father was a tanner, but also a successful wool dealer. And the young Piero went to abacus school and studied mathematics, effectively training for a career as a merchant. We know very little about his life. We do know of 26 surviving paintings, most still in situ. Nevertheless, some kind of life story can be pieced together, and by his late teens, there's evidence that he'd chosen the path of an artist. But San Sepolcro must have seemed too small for a young man with ambition, and like many, he decided to travel. Piero went first to Perugia, where he met a celebrated regional painter, Domenico Veneziano, and the two of them came here to Florence in 1439 and worked together on the decorations of the walls of a church which is now being destroyed. Now, Florence was this extraordinary cradle of culture. There'd been a rebirth of classicism 50 years or so before, and by this time, by the time Piero was here, there was an extraordinary flourishing of scholarship and arts, which no doubt fueled the young artist. The next few years remained something of a blank, but we know that around the age of 30, Piero returned to his hometown of San Sepolcro. Piero's first major work as an independent artist was this one, and we know that he signed a contract in 1445 to an organisation, a Compagnia, who were dedicated to Santa Maria della Misericordia, or the Blessed Virgin Mary of Pity and Charity, which had an oratory or a building on the edge of San Sepolcro, which it used to minister to the sick and the poor. And this was an altarpiece commissioned for the little chapel there. Now the structure of it is quite complicated, but it follows an existing altarpiece that Piero had to paint over, and the frame, which would have been wonderfully elaborate, is lost. And this reconstruction has all of Piero's work, all the panels, but the ornate frame that binds it together is lost. Nonetheless, this work, called the Misericordia altarpiece, is unified not because of Piero's style, which actually is very varied in this work, but because of the way he has a gold background that gives an ethereal glow to the work, which binds all pieces together, and because the 5 major figures in the work, 4 saints and the Virgin herself at the centre, are standing on the same stone step, which seems to cut through space and time. Now the work began in 1445 with the 2 figures on the left-hand side. On the extreme left, St. Sebastian, a saint who was deemed to protect people from the plague, and therefore had a great relevance to the Compagnia. And then St. John the Baptist. And the Baptist is painted in a radical way. First of all, his halo signifies his saintliness, but look, it's painted with real perspective, even though it's faded over the ages. Secondly, he clutches himself like so, and his eyes are lowered, as if he's focusing inwards on himself. In fact, some art historians have described it as a rather fanatical image. I think it's more mystical than fanatical. And then the crowning glory of Piero's first phase in painting this work, the crucifixion, which is above the Virgin Mary, and the Virgin Mary herself is clad in black and reaches out in a very dramatic gesture to her son, with John the Evangelist on the right-hand side seemingly running towards and opening himself up to his Lord and Master and Saviour. Now, a few years later, Piero paints in a style that's more relaxed, more calm. Some people think the emotion is deeper, I certainly do. And he completes the picture with 2 saints here on the right-hand side. On the extreme right is San Bernardino, a local saint from Siena, who died in 1444 and was canonised in 1450. And the fact that Piero has a halo above him means that he must have painted this image sometime soon after 1450. Now, Bernardino was part of a Franciscan order. He was a celebrated preacher who was part of a kind of religious revival or renewal that was going on through Tuscany and Umbria at this time. And then, to his left, St. John the Evangelist, author of the 4th Gospel, holding the book, leading into the central image, Mary, who actually is much smaller than life-size, but when you look at the picture, she seems a colossal figure because of the way she towers over her devotees who are kneeling at her feet, women on the right, men on the left. They're the figures with which we, and certainly the faithful who came to this in the 15th and 16th centuries, would identify with. And also, it reminds us that the cult of Mary, or Mariolatry, was rife during the 14th and 15th centuries. In fact, it's been estimated that of all churches built in the 14th and 15th centuries, more than 1/3 of them were dedicated in various forms to the Virgin Mary.
Piero's reputation was clearly spreading because around 1450 he received a commission from the Lord of Rimini, Sigismondo Pandolfo Malatesta. Piero paints him life-size and tries to show the world that Sigismondo wasn't just a successful soldier, nor the despot he was portrayed as by his various enemies. He kneels at the feet of his saintly namesake, whose bones are actually buried in the chapel in which the painting was made, and Piero's job as an artist is to try and bring everything back to life. But the majority of Piero's work remained in the town of his birth.
This work was painted around 1455 when Piero was living in San Sepolcro and was part of a much larger altarpiece for the church in San Sepolcro, Santa Maria della Pieve, where all the local baptisms took place, with the central panel, as we can see here, depicting the baptism of Christ. All the traditional elements are there. The old believers of the city of Jerusalem in the background, the new believers stripping off, with Christ, St. John the Baptist and the 3 angels. He makes it local though. The landscape, which he pays a good deal of attention to, is that of San Sepolcro and the Valley of the Walnuts, as it was known, with a walnut tree here in the foreground over Christ's head. There are two curious aspects to this painting though. One is the fact that Christ and St John look as if they're standing in a dry riverbed, but in fact Piero has very acutely observed the optical phenomenon of reflection and the angle of sunlight. Also, he's reflecting the biblical myth that there's a miracle that takes place in the Jordan when Christ is baptised and the flow is reversed. The second aspect is geometry. Scholars have related Piero's work and his compositions to the work of the great classical mathematician Euclid. To the naked eye, though, it's much easier to see this line, this central axis that starts at the very top of the arch, goes straight down through the dove or Holy Spirit, through the water that's being poured onto Christ's head, and straight down through his face and down through his hands. And everything emanates from that line. That's bang at the centre of the picture. And it's that idea, this geometric idea, that sets the tone for much of Piero's subsequent work.
A marked sense of geometry looms large in this, perhaps the oddest of all Piero's works, made around 1458. It shows the flagellation of Christ, tied to a column, being whipped by curiously languid Roman soldiers, while Pontius Pilate looks on. In the foreground, three men, dressed in the clothes of contemporary aristocrats, seem oblivious to what's happening. There have been numerous interpretations of the work and its iconography, the most interesting of which relates the three men to diplomats in the conflict between Christendom and the Turks. But the impact of the painting is spatial. It's like a giant chessboard on which the figures are being placed, and the perspective is so elaborately worked out that it can actually be reproduced in plan and elevation, creating a claustrophobic stage set in which a brutal ritual nonchalantly takes place.
In 1458, Piero comes here to Rome to decorate the papal apartments of Pius II, work which was subsequently covered up a few decades later by Raphael. But then, according to reports, Piero hears news that his mother's died, so he returns back north to San Sepolcro. It seems likely that sometime soon after the death of his mother, Piero began to work on one of his most celebrated and popular images, this one, the Madonna del Parto. Now, the Madonna del Parto means the Madonna of the Delivery, which is slightly a misnomer because she's not giving birth here, but is clearly in a heavily pregnant state. And the work resides in the small hill town of Monturchi, about 6 miles or so from San Sepolcro, and it was in a church where there was an altarpiece already in existence, and Piero painted this fresco over it, and it's now been moved to a rather drab school building behind protective glass to protect it from all the pilgrims who come from all over the world to look at it. Essentially, it's an image of revelation. The two angels on either side of the Virgin pull open this canopy or tent to reveal her, and at the same time it mirrors the gesture that she's making with her hand pointing to her womb, the idea of what's inside and what is about to burst forth, which in turn rhymes with this amazing space that Piero has created from the canopy behind her. And this idea of flip rhythms and rhymes in the painting is wonderfully exemplified with the two angels, who in fact, if you look at, are a mirrored image, one of the other. And this stems from the fact that Piero seems to have used the same cartoon or drawing, sketch, from one to the other, but just reversed it, and he's done the same with the colours of their robe and their wings, this browny red and green. The heart of the picture, and the dominant, most dramatic central image, is the opening in the Virgin's dress, to which she points. And we read this in two ways. Firstly, vaginal. This is the opening through which Christ will be born. But we also read it as a wound. And in a way, this anticipates or prophesies Christ's wounds on the cross. So in an image of birth, death is also present. But Mary, as the carrier of the Christ child, is also a symbol of hope, because through the birth of Christ, people will be saved. It's a route to salvation and redemption. People come from all over the world to look at this image, but its power is enhanced by our knowledge of what it was originally intended for. When it was there as an altarpiece in a church, it formed part of a cult that had developed in the 14th century throughout Tuscany and then into Umbria, where pregnant women would come to pray in front of images like this for the safe delivery of their child, and those who couldn't conceive came to pray for fecundity or fertility, that they might themselves have children. And when we look at this image and we compare it, say, to other images that Piero has made of the Virgin Mary, it seems more personalised, less generalised. And we can't help but think that this might have something to do with his own relationship to his mother and his state of mind after her death. The Madonna del Parto is perhaps Piero's most explicitly personal painting, but it was soon to be eclipsed by the most ambitious work of his entire life. Piero della Francesca's most spectacular work is here in the Cappella Maggiore in the church of San Francisco in the hill town of Arezzo. He began the work sometime around the middle of the 1450s, and we know he finished it by 1466. An epic saga in fresco, filling the wall with 15 or so grand scenes telling the story of the true cross. Now, the piece was commissioned by a wealthy mercantile family, the Bacci, but the tone of the piece was established by the Franciscan order who ran this church. And from the beginning, Piero was original. He wanted to experiment and innovate, not least with the technique of fresco. Now, traditionally, it's done on wet plaster, which Piero does to begin with. But restoration and cleaning has shown that in fact he also used tempera and oils on top of the surface of the fresco once it had dried to give it a kind of lustre and a sheen. Tragically, in the 19th century, these frescoes were badly restored and there was damp in them, and so some of them have been obliterated, but there's still enough here for us to see quite what an achievement it is. Now, the story of the true cross effectively is a 13th century epic saga that details the cross as an instrument of salvation, how it's lost and found and finally restored to Jerusalem, and all of that is told by Piero. But from the beginning he has his own original vision. So he starts right at the top with something totally from his own imagination. That is the aging Adam and Eve talking to their 3 children about the consequences of their original sin, from which, of course, salvation springs in the form of the cross. And from then on in, it's a saga really of Hunt the Cross in various forms, in the various images that he paints. Historians tell us that a contemporary audience would have made immediate sense of this work, but I find it an amazingly complex experience, where your eyes are drawn from left to right, from right to left, up and down, and crossways. And it seems to me there's the logical mind of a rather complex mathematician at work here. What I like is how you start to make these extraordinary juxtapositions, the most powerful of which are the 2 vast battle scenes that are on the lowest walls that in fact are closest to the viewer. Starting on the far wall with an image of Constantine, the first Christian emperor, defeating the infidel who scramble out of the river and off into the distance without any violence at all. All he does is show the cross to them, and rather than using military might, a miracle has taken place. On this wall, mirroring the non-battle scene we've just seen over there, Piero produces one of the most powerful depictions of a battle, I think, anywhere in Italian art. It reveals itself to you in different ways and in different facets every time you look at it. For a start, Piero seems to have done 7 or 8 layers deep of soldiers, 3 or 4 of which you could say are unnecessary, but he wants to marshal this idea of chaos. And when you look at the work, you see extraordinary images, expressions of fear, of anger, of humility, odd vignettes, like the limbs of a figure on the extreme left-hand side, bent at the knee and framing a head that's been decapitated. And it's one of those works that seems both intensely personal as well as universal. And in fact, we know that Piero may have witnessed the celebrated Battle of Anghiari in 1440 when the Milanese fought the Florentines, but also we do know that in 1453 he was issued with a crossbow by the commune of San Sepolcro in case he needed to fight in a battle against the Neapolitans. And so this sense of claustrophobia of being involved is probably the result of some kind of direct experience. The real impact of this work, though, through its ambition, through its scale, through its drama, through its sheer bravura, is that it seems to push Piero della Francesca right to the forefront of Italian, and indeed Western art, even though it was centuries before that genius was fully recognised.
As far as we can tell, Piero remained unmarried and childless. It may be something of a cliché, but it seems that he was married to his life as an artist.
In 1459, this large building was given over to the people of San Sepolcro
as a meeting place, and Piero della Francesca, as already the most distinguished artist in town, was given a commission to produce a work of art, and this is the result. Now, most works of art in places like this are explicit depictions of civic virtue. This, though, is almost unique because it's a religious subject matter and one of the most difficult, the resurrection of Christ, which is alluded to in the Gospels but not explicitly described. Now, why would Piero do that? Well, I think the most obvious answer is because here he is, having burst out of the Holy Sepulchre, burst out of the tomb, and of course San Sepolcro is named after the sepulchre, and the myth is that fragments from Christ's tomb were brought here in the 1st or 2nd century after, but not explicitly described. Now, why would Piero do that? Well, I think the most obvious answer is because here he is, having burst out of the Holy Sepulchre, burst out of the tomb, and of course San Sepolcro is named after the sepulchre, and the myth is that fragments from Christ's tomb were brought here in the 1st or 2nd century after his death. Piero's approach to depicting the resurrection is highly individual, highly original. We're down below, perhaps 6 or 7 feet from the bottom of the work. We look up to it. What we're confronted by initially are the 4 soldiers, some sleeping, one shielding his eyes as if he can't bear to look at that which we are looking at. But then we see the Holy Sepulchre. Now, there's an element of mystery here because we can't see how Christ has got out. We can't see if the lid of the sepulchre has been pushed to one side. And in a way, Piero manages to maintain the mystery of the resurrection by not showing us too much. On the other hand, when he shows us Christ, he shows us a huge amount. A muscular figure, credible, believable, as if one of us, although slightly larger than us, larger than life. But also, he shifted the perspective again, because it's as if, when we look at Christ, we're on the same level as him. He's painted Christ as if he shares the same plane. And by doing that, he suggests a real man having broken through death, rather than the sometimes fairy story-like depictions you get of Christ floating upwards above the tomb. And then look at Christ's eyes. This is the most extraordinary thing, I think, about the painting. He confronts us. They're hypnotic. This isn't the image of a gentle saviour. This is the image of someone who's gone through the night, who for 3 days has been wrestling with death and has finally conquered. And he holds the standard of the Red Cross that symbols his triumph over death. On the left-hand side, there are trees with no leaves on. On the right-hand side, the trees do have leaves. And that's a much flatter path. This is a much more rugged and steep path. And there's a choice being given here. And it's a moral painting. You have 2 choices. You can take the easy way that doesn't lead anywhere in particular, or you can take the hard slog, the passage of virtue. And this, I think, is the point of having the painting in this particular context. Because in the next room, this is where meetings took place and also where judgments were made. And in a way, Piero is using the central image of Christianity, the resurrection, as a way more practically of saying to people, judges and those who are about to be judged, to choose the more difficult but the virtuous path. There's a neat postscript to this painting, because it's widely believed that the soldier, leaning back against the tomb with his eyes closed, is Piero himself, and that this, in fact, is a self-portrait. Of course, we don't know, but there's a neat twist, I think, to this, because most artists, when they depict themselves in their work, have their eyes open, looking out at us, looking at their work. But Piero, one of the most enigmatic and mysterious figures in the history of Western art, chooses to paint himself with his eyes closed. And ironically, this work and this image is perhaps the closest we ever get to him. In the 1470s, Piero made the short journey to Urbino for a very illustrious commission. He'd been summoned to the court there to paint a double portrait of Federico da Montefeltro and his young wife, Battista Sforza, who was only 26 when she died in July 1472, having borne 8 daughters and finally a son and heir. Piero's portrait of the couple is believed to have been painted posthumously as a tribute from Federico to his wife. It's unusual to have a woman on the viewer's left, as this was considered the honorary position, but it's also to avoid showing his missing right eye, lost in a joust that also shattered his nose. For the remaining 20 years of his life, Piero stayed in San Sepolcro. During the mid-1470s, Piero began to write a book on perspective, This, more than his paintings, ensured that he was initially remembered after his death. At the heart of Piero's studies was an analysis of the proportions of the human body, which can be seen as part of an ongoing programme in Renaissance scholarship, where man is seen as the centre of all things. But Piero's so much more than a student of mathematical formulae, for his art shows that the human imagination is the real measure. Having spent his life painting works for other people, Piero seems to have ended his career with a work for himself, possibly for his family tomb. The work, in the past so harshly cleaned that the surface is damaged, shows the Nativity, with the shepherds visible in the background, and an angelic choir strumming and singing above the vulnerable Christ child who lies on his mother's robe in the foreground. It's an odd, disjointed image, but it's a joyful picture where Piero seems to have shed his customary sombreness in favour of a loud celebration, and with the sacred scene once again transported from the Holy Land to the outskirts of San Sepolcro. Piero died in 1492, his fame rapidly diminishing, partly because the great geniuses of the High Renaissance were about to burst onto the scene, and also because his work was in such mainly obscure places. But 400 years later, his reputation began to flourish. Cézanne and Picasso both hailed him. Today, thousands make the Piero pilgrimage to Italy, yet he still remains the most enigmatic of all the great artists. Hans Holbein has claims to be the greatest portrait painter who ever wielded a brush, a central figure in the spread of the Renaissance in Northern Europe, whose deftness and pinpoint accuracy captured the spirit and the faces of his age. An artist whose roots were continental, but he became the father of English painting. Hans Holbein the Younger was born in Germany in the imperial capital of Augsburg in 1498. He came from an artistic family. His father, Hans Holbein the Elder, was one of the leading artists of his generation in southern Germany, and his elder brother, Ambrosius, was already showing a precocious talent for drawing. So, as soon as the two boys could be made use of, they joined their father's workshop. But Augsburg was a lot more limited artistically. The further afield, particularly along the Rhine to the south, things looked a lot more promising. And so, in 1515, Hans, together with his older brother, came here to the city that he effectively put on the European artistic map, Basel. Basel was an attractive place for a young artist on the make, a thriving commercial city on the Rhine. It boasted a newly established university and a flourishing collection of printing presses. Books, pamphlets and title pages all need illustration, which Holbein was eager to supply. He was quickly accepted into Basel's intellectual circles, led by the humanist scholar Desiderius Erasmus, and it was a version of Erasmus's In Praise of Folly which gave the young artist an opportunity to show his skills, with a commission to provide illustrations in the margin of the celebrated satirical text which analysed human behaviour and weakness. When he was 18, Holbein got his first illustrious portrait commission to do a picture of the newly elected mayor of Basel, Jacob Mayer von Hasen, and his wife Dorothea. Now this is a very inventive picture. For a start, it's official, he's just been elected mayor, but the two figures are dressed relatively informally. But also, it's a double portrait that has two distinct images, who are separated, and yet they're bound together by the same architectural detail in the background and a consistent light source that casts a shadow in here from the right, that casts shadows on the architectural detail there and there. So what we have is two figures who are unified, but at the same time their own individuality is proclaimed. With Holbein, even from this stage, the detailing is extraordinary. And you look at the rings, numerous rings on the mayor's fingers. It looks like a knuckle duster to our eyes, but actually it's a sign of his own prosperity. He's a financier. He clutches a coin as a symbol of that, but also symbolising the fact that Basel has just been given permission to mint coins. He also points towards his wife in a gesture of love.
In a way, it's a rather unglamorous portrait. The background and the detailing is lavish, but these two figures are certainly not made to look particularly attractive. It's as if Holbein is painting them as they are or as they were. But Holbein's also making his own mark, and for the first time he signs his work, his initials HH and the date 1516, and a shield or a scroll surrounded by acanthus leaves, as if he's throwing off the shackles of his apprenticeship and emerging for the first time as a fully fledged artist. And in fact, from this moment on, his career takes off. He gets a commission from the mayor to decorate the Basel council chamber, which is subsequently destroyed. But from then on in, other portrait commissions also roll in, including this one of Bonifacius Amerbach, a professor of law at Basel University. This was an important commission for Holbein, for not only was Amerbach a close friend of Erasmus, but he became an important collector of Holbein's works. Here it's clear that his approach was evolving. A rare square format with a landscape adding depth to the image, and the painting containing an inscribed panel proclaiming its own merits. It reads, "I may be painted, unreal, but I am not inferior to life. I am my master's true likeness, as he was at 8 times 3 years." Holbein's growing confidence stemmed in part from his growing acceptance in Basel, where he was made a Master of the Guild of Painters. He was also granted citizenship 2 years later, after his marriage to a local woman, Elspeth Schmidt, with whom he would have 4 children. Holbein also began to turn his attention to religious images, both for public and private devotion. This altarpiece, showing 8 episodes of Christ's Passion, was begun by Holbein in 1524, some 7 years after an Augustinian monk and scholar called Martin Luther had nailed his 95 theses to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg, railing against the sale of indulgences, or pardons from sin, by the Catholic Church, and triggering a movement which began with the proposed reform of the papacy and ended up splitting the church, otherwise known as the Protestant Reformation, whose impact throughout Europe was huge. One of the most eloquent examples of painting inspired by the ideas of the Reformation, as well as being one of the most powerful works in the entire history of religious art, is this one, Holbein's image of the dead Christ, painted in 1521. What he does is a paradox, because in a way he's trying to affirm the idea of the Bible and Christ's life as a living force by painting it as graphically as possible, but through showing an image of Christ at his lowest ebb, when he's died and his flesh is beginning to rot and decay. There's all sorts of speculation about the fact that Holbein might have had a body that he found in the Rhine, put in his studio and used directly as a model for this work. But whether that's true or not, dead bodies were much more in evidence in late medieval or early modern Europe, and unlike our world, theirs was not sanitised from the idea and the image of death. What we see is something that's very curious and had art historians speculating for the last few centuries. Is this a commission? Is it the bottom part of an altarpiece? Well, there's no evidence to suggest that it is. And in the end, no records prove that the work was commissioned at all. And what we're left now is the thought that this may be a personal image of private devotion by Holbein. It's a painting that almost smells as you get close up to it, such is its power as a trigger for the imagination. Look at the eyes, how the sockets have become rigid. Rigor mortis is setting in. And what Holbein, I think, is trying to say, and I think achieves, is by showing Christ in this putrefied form, Christ, remember, is the Word made flesh, he's also emphasising the miracle of the resurrection. He's showing Christ as no artist has done before, at his lowest ebb. And in a way, it's an affirmation of Holbein's own personal faith. It's also a work which establishes him as one of the great talents of 16th century European painting. Of all Holbein's patrons in Basel during his early years, by far and away the most important for his subsequent career was Erasmus, one of the most celebrated scholars of the time. Erasmus's studies in Latin and Greek enabled him to translate the New Testament, which was eventually published in Basel in 1516, where he first came into contact with Holbein, whose intense scrutiny of his subjects seemed to strike a chord with the equally thorough scholar, who commissioned Holbein to produce half a dozen or so portraits of him over the next decade or so. I love these portraits that Holbein does of Erasmus. They have a detachment in their scrutiny and in their intense observation, but they're also so intimate. And it's as if Holbein, and by extension us, the viewer, have somehow crept into Erasmus's study and is peeking over the shoulder of the great scholar as he's wrapped up in his fur-lined cloak to keep the draughts away. And we're watching as he writes his commentary to St Mark's Gospel that we can read there, but we've caught him unawares. And in a way, there's a parallel between what the young artist is trying to do and what his intellectual mentor is doing. As Erasmus scrawls away, so Holbein has this intense control, and in a way, he's trying to produce some kind of parallel in a visual form to what Erasmus is doing in intellectual and written form. But the intellectual and religious turmoil in Middle Europe had certain negative spin-offs for artists, not least because religious commissions were suddenly frowned upon. And in addition, Holbein's portrait business here in Basel had all but dried up. So he looked further afield, starting in 1524 by a trip to France, where he tried to get work at the court of Francis I, but that was unsuccessful. And then, 2 years later, probably with a recommendation from Erasmus himself, he set sail for Tudor England to try and get work at the court of Henry VIII. And it was during the early part of Henry VIII's reign that the Renaissance was established in England. Architects, craftsmen, sculptors, painters and poets were all encouraged to make the journey across the Channel so that the king and his ministers might harness their talents to proclaim the power and sophistication of the Tudor monarchy.
It was Erasmus's links with England that provided Holbein with his first introduction to the English court. Chief amongst Erasmus's friends, and the first port of call for Holbein, was Thomas More, a fellow scholar and soon to become Lord Chancellor of England. More welcomed Holbein to his Chelsea home and commissioned him to paint a number of portraits of his household. Most of these no longer survive, but we have this delicate study for an elaborate family portrait. What does survive, however, is one of Holbein's most direct and precise portraits, that of Sir Thomas More himself, painted in 1527. More stares off into space, a man whose thoughts were on this world and the next, wearing the rich gold chain of a privy councillor. What really grabs the viewer's attention, though, and perhaps makes the hairs stand up on the back of your neck, are the hairs on More's chin, and the extraordinary detail rendered through hundreds, maybe thousands of tiny brushstrokes, which creates an image that seems almost photographic. In spite of his success here in England, Holbein had to return to Basel in 1528 because he was in danger of losing his citizenship. And over the next few years, in both Switzerland and then again here in England, he was to witness the full onslaught of the Reformation and its political consequences. During Holbein's absence, the Reformation had begun to take serious root here in Basel, and the implications were political as well as religious, with a small Catholic oligarchy being threatened by a Protestant democracy. But things turned ugly at the beginning of 1529, on Shrove Tuesday, when the whole city was supposed to be celebrating. And suddenly, an angry mob came up the hill here to the cathedral, broke in, tore down statues, smashed stained glass windows, and triggered off a wave of iconoclasm throughout the city. It's difficult to know what Holbein's religious views were at the time. He was born and brought up a Catholic, and he painted many religious works for Catholic patrons and churches. It's almost certain that many of Holbein's works were destroyed in the rioting, as very few still survive. But what he did out of economic necessity, and what he did from conviction, we'll never fully know. There's a clue, though, to his developing religious inclinations during the turbulent decade of the 20s in this woodcut, Christ as the True Light, which shows Christ pointing to a candle which illuminates the entire image and shows the way to the poor and the ordinary on the left, whilst to the right, the Pope and other church dignitaries follow Plato and Aristotle, the philosophers of the ancient, classical, pagan world, into the abyss, an image of clear and strong Protestant sentiment, challenging the authority of the Catholic Church and its arcane teachings. During his time back in Basel, Holbein found time to paint a portrait that wasn't a commission, and in fact, for many, was the most intimate work of his life. It shows his wife, Elspeth, and two of his four children, Philip, who's about 6, and Katharina, who's 2. In fact, Elspeth is pregnant with the 3rd child when this was made. And it's a very curious work, not least because the background seems so bleak. It's black,
it enhances the figures, it makes them stand out in relief, and it also emphasises the fact that the composition mirrors the traditional image of the mother and child, or in fact Leonardo's image of St Anne, the Madonna and Child. But in fact there's something more practical here, or impractical, because somewhere down the line after Holbein finished this work, and he did the portraits on paper, they've been cut out and then mounted on a panel, and so this isn't quite how they're intended to be seen. But it's a very, very sad work. His son looks up, I think, more in hope than in expectation, and the daughter, the young Caterina, doesn't seem to know the figure that's painting her. But look at the face of the wife. She's red-eyed, her face looks slightly puffy, and it's almost as if she knows that Holbein is not going to be around for much longer, and in fact he isn't. He can't find work in Basel, and so in the end, in 1532, he goes back to England and never returns, leaving the family, effectively, to fend for themselves. But the England of 1532 was dramatically different from the country that Holbein had left in 1528. In fact, it was on the edge of revolution, with Henry VIII in the middle of trying to secure a divorce from Catherine of Aragon. The divorce scandalised Europe and led to a split with the papacy, with Henry VIII proclaiming himself head of the Church in England. Holbein's patron, Sir Thomas More, opposed the divorce, resigned, and was eventually executed, but it doesn't seem to have had a detrimental effect on the painter's prospects, because very soon he was moving in the circles surrounding the future Queen, Anne Boleyn, including More's rival and later Chancellor of the Exchequer, Thomas Cromwell.
Cromwell became the architect of the English Reformation, supporting the break with Rome and cementing it through the dissolution of the monasteries. He was depicted in both oil paint and, even more tellingly, in this preparatory drawing by Holbein, as a man of ruthless, single-minded ambition.
And in the midst of all these troubles, and directly connected to them, Holbein is commissioned to paint what becomes his most celebrated, famous and complex work. This one, The Ambassadors, painted in 1533, showing two men, a rare example, a very early example in European art, of a double full-length portrait. Jean de Dinteville, he's the ambassador from the French court in London, and Georges de Sèvres, he's the Bishop of Lavaur, who comes over because his friend Jean is having problems negotiating with Henry VIII on behalf of the King of France, because Henry is antagonistically involved in an argument with the Pope. Now, Jean de Dinteville commissions the portrait, and that might explain why he seems to be the most prominent figure. He dominates, certainly in terms of surface area. As always with Holbein, the details give us a much greater sense of knowledge of these two men and their world. For a start, Jean clutches an elaborate dagger sheath that has on it his age, 29. Georges leans on a book that gives us his age, 25. And then we realise that in the centre of the picture, between the two men, is a celebration of the Renaissance world and scholarship that the two of them practice. So, starting at the top, Holbein gives us a celestial globe of the stars and the heavens, and also recently invented navigational tools. And then down below, there's a terrestrial globe, with France clearly visible. Then there's an odd textbook. Next to it is a hymn book open on the page of a hymn written by Martin Luther, of all people. And then some musical instruments, a lute and a collection of flutes. So what do we make of all this? Well, certain scholars have put forward the view, and it seems perfectly credible to me, that this mathematical book is about the process of division, and that Luther himself, as well as being a reformer, is also a divider of the church, and that the lute with its broken string is a symbol of frailty, but also it means that the hymn can't be fully realised. And so, what is happening here is that there's a comment by Holbein on the religious situation specifically in England and also more broadly in Europe. But I think the key to these paintings are in two details that are not here in the centre, but they're found first of all in the top left-hand corner, which is the crucifix, which is barely in view, but is making its presence felt. But secondly, and much more curious, is this form here in the foreground that you can only see when you start to walk and look from another perspective. And then you see, clearly from this angle, that it's a skull through a process known as anamorphosis, or stretching or distorting the image. And it's clear that there's this great symbol thrust across the surface of the painting that is a memento mori, a reminder of death, and the frailty of human life. And I think the broader point is being made by Holbein here, that in fact conflict obscures the truth. The truth is up there in the top left-hand corner of the painting for Holbein. Christ himself crucified on the cross. That's the redemptive hope for mankind. But I think also Holbein is making an even more interesting point with this work, and it's to do with the whole process of painting, what Holbein has devoted his life to. Because no one in European art up to this point has scrutinised the natural world as closely as Holbein and rendered it with such extraordinary care and attention and detail. And what he's managing to show us in this painting is that you can have scholarship, you can have diplomacy, you can have an expanded new culture of learning, but that you will never grasp the bigger picture, you'll never understand the world totally from one fixed viewpoint, and that you have to see the world from a number of different perspectives, and that, I think, is a very profound point.
Within 3 years of painting the ambassadors, Holbein got the position he really wanted, painter to the king, and began a series of portraits that have defined how that most familiar of English monarchs has been seen down the ages. This is the quintessential image of an overbearing and tyrannical monarch. Holbein depicts the king seemingly at face value, emphasising the small humorless eyes and mouth, the curiously flat cheeks and chin. But his authority is clear, formidable even, amplified by opulent jewellery depicted in real gold leaf, and helping to create a domineering presence even though the work itself is small. Consequently, Henry approved of the painting, as did Thomas Cromwell, who was cleverly encouraging the use of the painter to promote the power of the monarch. An idea which was reinforced when Holbein was commissioned to paint a group portrait of the Tudor dynasty for Henry's Whitehall Palace. Subsequently destroyed in the Palace Fire of 1698, showed Henry and his now third wife, Jane Seymour, together with his parents, Elizabeth of York and Henry VII. The image of the two Henrys, which survive in this preparatory drawing, affirms the idea of dynastic progression and increasing power from lean father to vast son. But the Queen, Jane Seymour, was to die giving birth to Henry's long-awaited heir. But the king didn't spend much time mourning. Together with the assistance of his Chancellor Cromwell, he decided to try and find a new wife, preferably one who would combine political advantage with the physical beauty that Henry sought. And so Holbein was dispatched to Europe to paint suitable candidates from which Henry could then make his matrimonial choice.
Holbein's first port of call is to Brussels to paint this young woman, Christina of Denmark, the Duchess of Milan. Now she's the younger daughter of the King of Denmark, who's a Lutheran and who's been deposed. She's also married to the Duke of Milan, but is a widow by the age of 12. 4 years later, when she's 16, she's ready to sit for this portrait because the King of England wants to marry her. Now Holbein gets 3 hours with her in a date in March, and he sketches her face and her hands and makes intricate studies, which is reflected in the finished oil. And when Henry sees the results, rumour has it that he falls in love. Certainly he wants to marry her. He sees, if not a ravishing beauty, someone who's young and will give him more heirs, perhaps a healthy heir. But politically, there are machinations. She's very well connected. She's also the niece of the Emperor Charles V, who doesn't want any connection with Henry VIII. And so the wedding doesn't take place. Her response, though, is a bit more diplomatic. She says, if I had 2 heads, I'd happily place one at the disposal of the King of England.
Henry finally settled on marrying Anne of Cleves, but Holbein was placed in an impossible position. He was dispatched to the Rhineland with orders to produce an instant likeness of Henry's next intended, but he needed to exercise diplomacy and tact. Anne's dress seems to have fascinated Holbein more than the strangely lifeless symmetry of her features, and Henry's displeasure at finding Anne of Cleves, more, as he put it, like a flat Flanders mare when she arrived for the marriage ceremony in January 1540, cost Holbein dear in prestige. In fact, he received no further significant work from Henry. 3 years later, having completed his last portrait, that of himself, Holbein fell seriously ill and died, probably the victim of the plague which had spread through London in 1543. He was 45 years old. Holbein's influence on British painting is enormous. He made the human individual seem more real and more exposed than any artist before him, and is the father of a tradition of portraiture which continues to this day. But he also created images of a king and his court which has lived on in the popular imagination, bringing to life one of the most dramatic periods in English history.
George Stubbs is the greatest painter of horses who ever lived. He was a sporting artist, but so much more than that. A man who literally dissected his subject before he felt able to paint it. He's also a tough, disturbing and complex artist, but rarely one who also strikes the broadest popular chord. So in 1977, these two paintings were about to be sold. Perhaps they were going to leave the country. And so the Tate Gallery moved in, but it didn't have the £774,000 required to buy them. So the public responded. There was an early form of lottery established. There was a crossword competition and a writing competition. And in the end, over 6 months, the money was raised by the people in order that the work should remain in the National Collection for the people.
George Stubbs was born in Liverpool in 1724. His father, who objected to his son's early artistic interest, was a currier, preparing horse hides for the local tanneries. So as a boy, Stubbs was made to work for his father, and only after his death in 1741, when Stubbs was 17, was he able to make any serious commitment to art. He worked for a short time assisting the provincial painter Hamlet Winstanley, copying prints. Afterwards, he spent time again at the family home, drawing and studying anatomy, relying for financial support from his mother. And this is the first work that is known to us by Stubbs. It was painted in 1746, when Stubbs was 22, a double portrait of Sir Henry Nelthorpe and his second wife. We don't know how the Stubbs came to be known to the Nelthorpes, but this was an important first commission, as the family would prove loyal patrons to Stubbs in the years to come. Shortly afterwards, he moved to York, furthering his study of anatomy at the county hospital. There he came into contact with the obstetrician Dr. John Burton, who asked Stubbs to illustrate a book he was currently writing on the improvements in midwifery methods. Stubbs had no experience in etching, so he went to see a decorative painter in Leeds to pick up the basics. The 18 plates that Stubbs subsequently produced were his first published works. It was around this time that Stubbs met Mary Spencer, who would remain his lifelong companion and assistant. They never married, but had a son shortly after meeting.
And then in 1754, Stubbs joined the stream of young British artists on the Grand Tour, making their way to what they consider to be the cradle of Western civilization, Italy.
Stubbs was one of the first generation of British artists for whom a trip to Italy seemed a prerequisite for success. However, Stubbs seemed unmoved by the experience, staying only a few months and finding nothing to admire, being quoted as saying, "Nature was and is always superior to art, whether Greek or Roman."
And it was this idea of drawing from nature that inspired Stubbs to study in intricate detail the anatomy of a horse. And probably with financial help from the Nelthorpes, he began the project that was to transform his reputation.
For 18 months, beginning in 1756, Stubbs, together with his companion Mary Spencer, lived and worked in an isolated farmhouse in Lincolnshire, where they embarked on a systematic study of the anatomy of the horse. Able to rely on a constant supply of dead horses from the local tanneries, Stubbs would suspend the cadavers from the ceiling on a series of hooks, forming the horse into a lifelike pose, and then he'd set to work, slowly removing the layers of skin and muscle, recording every detail until only the skeleton remained. His research was both anatomical and archaeological, delving deep into the recesses of the equine body, laying it bare in order more fully to understand how it worked from the inside out, and all in order to paint it as accurately as possible. It was the first new study of the subject for over 150 years, but it was unprecedented in its detail.
Stubbs was determined to publish the anatomy of a horse, and he brought his drawings to London. and he showed them to a number of professional engravers, but no one would take up the project because the subject matter was so unusual. So instead, Stubbs decided to publish his prints himself, and so he worked on the project part-time while still earning a living from painting portraits, and it took him 8 years. But finally, in 1766, the remarkable Anatomy of a Horse was published.
And it couldn't have come at a better time, for in 1750 the Jockey Club was founded in England, made up of wealthy aristocrats intent on regulating and promoting race meetings. In addition, they were keen to find an artist who could depict their prized horses in a realistic manner, and Stubbs was only too pleased to supply the market. The first commission was for the Duke of Richmond, for his seat at Goodwood House in Sussex. And this is Stubbs' first depiction of the horse in paint, of the Charlton Hunt. The Duke, who was 28 at the time of the painting, an active military officer, is in the centre of the picture, sitting tall in his saddle, wearing the Goodwood blue, the livery of the Charlton Hunt, with his brother, Lord George Lennox, advancing towards him. And in the background, the hunt itself takes place. The Charlton Hunt kennels were famous for their thoroughbred foxhounds, and these in the foreground were the first that Stubbs had the chance to observe, portraying them with great individuality and a little affection. With the backing of such patrons, Stubbs started the most productive period of his career. Beginning in 1762 with a series of paintings of mares and foals, Stubbs arranges his work in an almost classical frieze-like composition, free from the bridles, the saddles and the spurs of the racecourse, and they seem almost sculptural in form, illustrating just how Stubbs was trying to elevate mere animal paintings to the status of high art. This combination of drawing from life and then arranging the horses into an idealised composition was a potent one. But Stubbs' painting went a stage further in perhaps his greatest and certainly his most eye-catching masterpiece.
It's called Whistle Jacket, and it's one of the greatest equestrian paintings ever made. Now, Whistle Jacket was a Palominian stallion owned by the Marquis of Rockingham, who'd made his owner a pretty substantial fortune on the racecourse. But he was retired in 1759, put out to stud, but 3 years later, Rockingham decided he wanted a painting of his prized possession. And there's all sorts of stories about this work, not least because Whistle Jacket has no background, there's no context. Instead, he's set against a void. And one of the theories is that in fact, Rockingham, who was intricately involved with affairs of state and later, for a brief period, became Prime Minister, wanted to commission an equestrian portrait of King George III. And that having got this far, he decided, along with Stubbs, that they wouldn't bother to put the king on the horse, nor would they bother to fill in the background. Now that may or may not be true. What I think is certainly true, and we know this from Stubbs' records, is that he always paints the horses first and then the background second. And I think that he probably realised, along with his patron, that this was enough, that it needed nothing else. But it gives the work a kind of timeless quality and a very contemporary or very modern feel too. It's the kind of painting that, because of its energy, because of the fact that it's this monumental or life-size image of a horse, it really seems to have caught the public imagination over the centuries and spawned all kinds of stories, the best of which came about when the work was first shown, and it was claimed that Whistle Jacket himself was confronted by this canvas when Stubbs was painting it out in the paddock just as he was finishing it, and the horse saw it, reared up and tried to kick it, and then together with the stable lad, Stubbs had to restrain him, and apparently he beat him with his mahl stick and his palette. I think that's pretty ludicrous though, not least because can you imagine a canvas of this size out in a muddy paddock and a painter like Stubbs having to wrestle with it? I think it's clear that he sketched and drew him and observed very closely this horse as it was paraded to and fro in front of him, but that clearly the canvas itself was completed in Stubbs' studio. But what we're left with is this extraordinary image of vitality and vigour, of a horse that has been very successful on the racecourse, but now is out to stud and has this amazing virility, if you like. It's also a work that seems incredibly composed. The image is taut, it's pulled in by its frame. Look at the tail, the way it lifts up to give balance. Look at the way the pointed ears that are there. Look at the expression on the face, the flash in the eye. It's an image of absolute perfect poise, but at the same time, it threatens to burst out of the frame. And it's that, I think, that sense of almost abstract taut energy that gives the painting its ongoing power. By 1762, when Stubbs was 38, he'd emerged as the leading sporting artist of the day. The problem, though, was the art establishment, because for them, painting was an intellectual pursuit and the result of imagination, as well as the acute powers of observation that Stubbs brought to it. The landscape of the racetrack and of the stables was restricted, and so Stubbs had to look further afield.
The Creswell Crags are an isolated rock formation on the borders of Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire, a rugged landscape of limestone cliffs whose drama and beauty perfectly conformed to the emerging idea of the picturesque, and which gave Stubbs a more natural setting in which he could depict his horses, but where they could also be exposed to the more savage forces of nature.
Now, the landscape of Creswell Crags provided the backdrop for a series that eventually numbered 17, of which this is an early example, that one art historian called Animal History. And it shows a lion going through various stages of attacking a horse. And I think probably it could be argued that for the first time in his career, Stubbs puts the landscape in first before the animals then populate the picture. And here you see the horse recoiling in fear as out of the darkness comes this lion. Now, in the series, there are 4 stages of the narrative. The first is the lion at distance frightening the horse. Then he's moving in closer. Then thirdly, he attacks. And then fourthly, the horse sinks under the weight as the lion puts teeth and claws into the flesh of the poor horse. Now, the precedents for this were classical. In Rome, on the Capitoline Hill, there was an antique sculpture of a lion attacking a horse. It's pretty clear that Stubbs had seen that. It's also pretty clear that he's trying to elevate sporting painting and give it something of the status of classical art or grand style art. But he's also, in these works, putting himself forward as a painter of the imagination, as well as someone who looks and observes. Because although it was perfectly plausible that he'd seen a lion at one of his patrons' menageries, Lord Shelbourne had a lion at his house on Hounslow Heath, nonetheless, Stubbs could never have seen a lion attacking a horse. And what he's also trying to do is put forward an idea that was philosophically very strong at the time, namely that of the sublime. The idea of the sublime, written by the philosopher Edmund Burke, published first in 1759, was the awe and the terror that human beings feel when they're confronted by the awesome power of nature. This is usually made manifest in storms, particularly at sea, and Turner later on became a great exponent of the sublime in painting. Here, in something that seems slightly more populist, Stubbs has the idea of the sublime force of a wild animal and the fear the horse feels when confronted by it. And so in a way, what he's doing here is managing to combine high art theory with the more popular tastes of the day. And in fact, these paintings and the prints that he made and a relief he did for Wedgwood pottery of the same subject were amongst the most popular works that he ever produced.
Stubbs was also commissioned to paint a number of other wild animals which were just arriving in Britain, the trophies of a newly powerful and growing empire. And this image of a cheetah, sent as a gift to George III from a former Governor-General of Madras, commemorates an event that took place in Windsor Great Park, in which the cheetah was set loose on a stag in order to observe its hunting technique. In the end, the experiment was a failure though, as the stag easily defended itself. In Stubbs' painting though, there is a sense of the exotic, both animal and human, and Stubbs paints both the cheetah and its Indian attendants with equal drama and attention to detail.
But Stubbs' main source of income was still painting portraits of horses for wealthy clients, and in 1765 he began a series set on the Newmarket racecourse, beginning with an extraordinary pair of landscapes populated by no horses and no human beings, of which this is perhaps the most poignant example. It's a real gem of a painting, and it shows here on the left-hand side what's called a rubbing down house, where the horses were bought after a race or after exercise, and they were rubbed down with either cloths or bits of straw to get the sweat off them. And you have this amazing sense of distance, where you see these 2 viewing stands, and this post in the middle, like a tower, which in fact is a betting post, but the whole painting reverberates with a sense of emptiness. This is the line, the track up which the horses will race. But Stubbs manages to give the racecourse almost a kind of mythical feel. But this is also a kind of formal exercise, where Stubbs is establishing the backdrop, and then, in the next painting, he puts the horses in. In Gimcrack on Newmarket Heath, Stubbs has shown both the aftermath of the race in the foreground and the race itself. So this is a really archaic presentation of the subject, in defiance of the normal unities of time and place. In the 18th century, racing drew enormous crowds from the many different stratas of society, and the racecourse was the venue for frantic betting, boxing and cockfighting. The crowds would line the course, leaving only enough space for the horses to pass through. But these elements are entirely absent in Stubbs's vision of Newmarket. But he was much less of a documentary painter and more interested in the drama and the spirit of the occasion. In 1785, Stubbs produced this pair of paintings that shows just how much he wanted to broaden the subject matter of his art. This is called The Reapers, and this is The Haymakers. And the two works sit wonderfully well together. There's a continual line, if you like, of action, and you could reverse them and create a kind of pyramid from the trees or the landscape in the background. And what Stubbs is doing here is showing the rural world at work. It's a kind of daily or mundane occurrence. Now, there's plenty of precedence for this subject matter in art, but the workers tend to be sentimentalised. I don't think Stubbs does that, but I think what he does do is idealise them slightly. They all wear immaculate and rather smart costumes. In a way, Stubbs is trying to affirm their dignity. He's also showing, in an almost manifesto or diagrammatic style, the different activities, from the raking to the reaping to the putting on the back of the hayrick. But at the same time, he's imposing this huge sense of order in the work. Look at this composition here. It's a very strong pyramid. And then the dominant form there on the right-hand side of the owner or the agricultural estate manager. The idle classes just looking over the workers at work. And then in the distance, there's a spire also looming large in the picture. And these two symbols of authority which tower over the people going about their daily tasks. And I think one of the things Stubbs is trying to do here, apart from choreograph what's tantamount to a mechanical or workers' ballet, is show the dignity and the hard work that goes on in the countryside. And at the time, there was growing dissent in the countryside, and certainly amongst the urban classes. There was a feeling that the countryside was a problem, and what Stubbs is trying to do is redress the balance and show a disciplined and harmonious world there. And he showed these at the Royal Academy, and he also used them as a basis for popular prints, perhaps to show the world that in fact the countryside wasn't much of a problem. But the response was critical. In fact, people said this isn't how the countryside is. It didn't reinforce the stereotypical view. Now, if we spin on a couple of hundred years to 1977, when there's a danger that these works will be lost to the nation, but of course the nation rallies, raises the money, and here they are now preserved for posterity. In the press, all the talk is of these works embodying or capturing the essence of Englishness, something that subsequently is lost. In fact, though, that flies totally in the face of the response to those who saw these works initially. And there's something deeply and quite satisfyingly contradictory about these paintings. In 1795, at the age of 71, Stubbs embarked on the systematic task of exploring and recording the comparative anatomy of humans, tigers and common fowl. Over the next 11 years, Stubbs produced more than 120 drawings and 4 volumes of text. What is proposed by the comparative anatomy is that scientific inquiry could be beautiful and enlightening, that science and aesthetics are not opposed, but could exist fruitfully together, an idea which still has contemporary resonance. Stubbs' last great work, and some would say his greatest, now resides in Northern Ireland at Mount Stewart, one of the country houses of the family who commissioned it. Henry Vane Tempest was a 28-year-old landowner who was wealthy enough to indulge in his twin passions of racing and gambling, and who, in 1796, bought one of the great horses of his time, Hambletonian. You could say that Stubbs immortalised Hambletonian, but in fact,
his place in racing history was assured. He'd won the Doncaster Gold Cup and the St Leger, and then on the 25th of March 1799 he took part in one of the races of the decade, together with another great horse called Diamond, whose owner, Joseph Cookson and Henry Van Temple, put up a purse between them of 3,000 guineas. The race was staged at Newmarket, where Stubbs had painted over the previous few decades, and drew crowds of tens of thousands. Apparently, according to contemporary accounts, you couldn't get a bed within a 15-mile radius of the place, and over 30,000 guineas.
Francisco Goya has often been described as the last of the great old masters and the first of the new. He painted sublime portraits of the Spanish royal court and celebratory pictures of the good life in Spain, but he also produced some of the most harrowing images of human cruelty ever created. His work is a compelling mixture of public documentation and private nightmare. It can also make the stomach churn in its uncompromising bleakness and power. Not much is known of Goya's early life as a painter, but he seems to have followed a fairly conventional path. The son of a master gilder, Goya was born on the 30th of March 1746 in Fuendentodos, a small provincial village in central Spain. He began his artistic studies at the age of 13 with the local artist José Luzán in nearby Zaragoza. In time-honoured fashion, he travelled to Italy in 1770 to acquaint himself with the old masters and classical antiquity, and on his return to Spain he got his first commission to paint a vault in the El Pilar Cathedral in Zaragoza. Adoration of the Name of God, painted in 1772 when Goya was just 26, is clearly influenced by the Baroque style he'd seen on his travels, with angels supported by billowing clouds surrounding the name of God, here written in a triangle to symbolise the Trinity, in Hebrew. In 1773, at the age of 27, Goya married Josefa Bayeu, sister of Francisco Bayeu, then a rising star at the Spanish royal court, and who was to help Goya in the coming years. But Goya's marriage was plagued with tragedy. Of the 8 children that he had, only one, Javier, would survive into adulthood. Professionally though, Goya's horizons were about to expand. At the beginning of 1775, with Goya approaching his 29th birthday, he came to the city that would define him as an artist, Madrid. The city was undergoing a transformation under King Charles III. Many artists were attracted to the city, and with the extensive building and city planning in progress, Madrid was fast becoming a picturesque city of international stature.
Within a year of arriving in Madrid, Goya produced a series of paintings, of which this is among the most celebrated. It's called The Picnic, and it shows an idyllic scene on the banks of the river Manzanares, just outside Madrid, where a group of characters are indulging in an afternoon's frolicking. And it also shows 2 social types, mayos and mayas. They're from the lower classes, they're artisans, sometimes they're on the verge of criminality, but they're free spirits. As you can see, flagons of wine have been consumed, they've eaten, and then they're lounging around in the sun, flirting, as pudding arrives, in the form of this figure, the orange seller, who shows her wares, but at the same time flirts and gestures off into the distance as if to say to one of the men, "Come with me if you want." But the whole purpose of this painting isn't just an idyllic celebration, nor is it to show Goya's amazing facility as a young artist. This painting had another purpose. In fact, it was a cartoon or a study for a tapestry.
In the 18th century, the tapestry was immensely prized by Spanish aristocrats, who not only used it for decoration, but looked to it as denoting social status and wealth. Goya got the job at the Royal Tapestry Manufactory on the recommendation of his brother-in-law, Francisco Bayeu. Here, Goya and other artists produced the designs that would be copied onto the manufactory looms. The images tended to be portraits of country life, of sport and other innocent rustic pursuits. But it wasn't long before Goya started to introduce an edgier note into his work. In this picture, called The Blind Guitarist, the grotesquely painted figure of the musician begins to play in front of a group of well-to-do folk out for their stroll. In contrast to the shadowy figure of the musician, a man in a dazzling yellow coat reaches into his pocket,
for a coin with which to fob off the busker. But he can't be so easily brushed aside, and nor will he disappear from Goya's future work, where there develops a contrast of light and dark, of the frivolous and the more sinister side of human life. But there's also a growing ambition and scale in Goya's work, evident in this tapestry design created in 1788. It's called the Meadow of San Isidro, and shows the city of Madrid celebrating the feast of its patron saint. Goya described the work as his most arduous challenge to date, a painting of some 7.5 meters in length, showing feasting, frolicking figures on the banks of the Manzanares River, with the city visible in the distance. The design, though, never made it into a tapestry, due to the death of the king, for whose palace it was intended. Instead, it was bought by the Duke and Duchess of Osuna. With his election to the Royal Academy in Madrid in 1880, Goya was able to find the support of aristocrats such as these. And this portrait of the Osuna family, painted in 1789, is typical of the many that Goya did throughout his career, showing the wealthy patrons in all their finery. Goya had rapidly become the painter of Spanish society, the most sought-after portraitist in the city and beyond. But privately, he was having doubts about his success, fearful of the fact that he may have been merely selling out to the market. And then, in 1792, whilst travelling to Andalusia to visit friends, Goya became seriously ill. The exact nature of his illness isn't known, but it lasted several months and left him profoundly deaf for the rest of his life. Whilst he was recuperating from his illness, Goya began to work in a much more radical and experimental way. In a series of 14 small paintings made on tin, and which he referred to as his cabinet pictures, Goya wrestled with the unpredictability of human existence, where life can be snuffed out at any moment, and where sanity and reason can easily descend into a pit of madness. But if the cabinet paintings seemed powerful arenas in which Goya's imagination began to run riot, they were nothing in comparison to his first great graphic series, produced through the 1790s and finally published in 1799, 80 images called Los Caprichos. Los Caprichos, or the Caprices, is a kaleidoscope of human delusion and weakness. Here, Goya rips into the world around him, the vanity, pomposity and stupidity of Spanish society. No one would escape from his savagely satirical gaze. Fluctuating between the natural and the unnatural, Goya produced a collection of images, the like of which had never been seen before. Not surprisingly, the public response to Los Caprichos ranged from incomprehension to outrage. And from the first edition of 300, Goya sold less than 60 sets. Later, as an old man, he said he withdrew it from public sale because he feared the Spanish Inquisition. However, the work was to fuel much of the best and darkest work for the rest of his life. Goya still needed to earn a living though, and returned to painting large-scale portraits. The Duchess of Alba was one of the most compelling women in Spain, and she became Goya's most famous model and his passionate love. Here the Duchess is clad in the costume of the Maya, a dress which had become fashionable with the aristocracy at that time. And inscribed on her two rings are their names, Alba and Goya, which points down to her feet, with which she seems to have written in the sand, Solo Goya, only Goya. But whether Goya's infatuation with the Duchess was ever reciprocated is unknown. The Duchess of Alba was instrumental in making this particular part of Madrid a fashionable one because she bought land here on the banks of the river Manzanares, and this church, that of San Antonio de la Florida, became the court church, and in the summer of 1798 Goya was given the job of decorating the ceiling. The commission itself was a relatively traditional one, but Goya's response was anything but. The subject is that of the 13th century legend of St. Anthony of Padua, who appeared during a court hearing in his native city of Lisbon in order to save his father, who'd been unjustly accused of murder. At the saint's bidding, the dead man came back to life to accuse the real murderer. But the main action seems almost overshadowed by the surrounding crowd, a motley crew of vagabonds and blind beggars. Hardly the normal depiction
of floating angels that we normally find in Baroque church frescoes. In spite of the grotesque nature of some of the San Antonio murals, and indeed of the Capriccios, Goya's reputation in royal circles was never higher, and in 1799 he was appointed principal court painter, and a year later, in 1800, he was commissioned to paint what became perhaps the greatest royal group portrait of the 19th century. It shows King Charles IV and his extended family, 14 almost life-size figures that are each individuals in their own right. And in the way that Goya paints, the decorations, the sashes, the silk and brocade shimmer of the dresses is a kind of miracle in itself. As you get close up though, those details dissolve into a miasma of brushstrokes, and the message seems to be, keep your distance, which reaffirms, if you like, the royal dignity or authority. At the heart of the painting is the Queen, Mary Louisa, who forms this pivot as a kind of triangle with her husband, King Charles, and then her son, the Crown Prince Ferdinand. And all the other figures are really there just as bit part played. People have looked at this work and tried to read into it the idea that Goya may be caricaturing the family. This, I think, is wrong. It's also slightly unfair. The Bourbons were notoriously ugly, and people have pointed out in particular that the Queen is no oil painting, to use the cliché. But in fact, I find this image rather tender. But what gives the painting its real edge is the presence of Goya on the left-hand side, depicting himself in the act of painting the picture. And of course this is a direct homage to the greatest royal group portrait ever made by Velázquez, Goya's great rival, if you like. But what emerges from this picture is the idea that Goya is a schizophrenic artist of kinds, that there are two sides to him, that he has this light side, the side that is the traditional and official court painter, but also he has this private, introspective, imprisoned side, the dark side. And it's this dark, dangerous, sometimes erotic, sometimes political vision that dominates the second half of Goya's career. This is one of the most famous pairs of paintings in the history of art, the first of two celebrated pictorial double acts that Goya did at the beginning of the 19th century. And it shows a woman in exactly the same pose, one clothed, the other naked. Art historians locate this work somewhere between Titian's Venus of Urbino and Manet's Olympia, but it's probably closer to the truth to say that Goya was more inspired by Velázquez's great image of the Rugby Venus, owned by the Spanish Prime Minister of Goya's day, Manuel Godoy, who it's widely believed commissioned these works from Goya. She looks at us unflinchingly as we look at her, and that draws people into the picture and to wonder who this woman might be. And some said it was the Duchess of Alba, but it's clearly not her. And others have speculated it might have been Godoy's mistress. But I think the best way of reading the work is as an embodiment of a modern and increasingly liberated Spanish woman. The picture, after all, is called The Naked Maya, the artisan with a liberal free spirit. And I think it's that Goya's getting at, as she lies openly displaying her body with no hint of shame whatsoever. In the dress version, her body's hidden, but her sexuality becomes more emphasised. You see the curves in more pronounced ways. Also, the costume is Turkish, those golden slippers, and there's a kind of exoticism to the work. Images of reclining nude women have a long and distinguished history in art, but not in Spain when the Inquisition is raging. In fact, King Charles III wanted to burn all the images of nude women in the royal collection. Now, there's been some very interesting speculation about how these two works would have been displayed in Godoy's collection. Some people have come up with a theory that there was even a kind of mechanical device that had dressed woman, and then it flips up to reveal the undressed woman underneath, rather like those pens that adolescents have, that when you turn, the woman's clothes slowly fall off. I'm not sure that that happened, but I do think that having a dressed image next to an undressed image gives a more erotic frisson, even though the implication was that by covering her up, you added respectability. And it was Godoy, painted here by Goya in 1801, who put into motion events that would throw Spain into turmoil and inspire Goya to create some of his greatest works. In 1808, Godoy had given Napoleon Bonaparte free passage through Spain on his way to Portugal, effectively delivering his country into French hands.
Napoleon forced the king to abdicate and put his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the throne. Revolt soon broke out throughout the country, and a brutal guerrilla war began.
The war didn't just take place on battlefields, it took place in the towns and cities of Spain too, where insurrection was brutally put down. And so there were newspaper reports and verbal accounts, but also Goya would have seen some of the atrocities. And this led him to produce what is still one of the most powerful indictments of human conflict ever made, his second great graphic series, The Disasters of War.
Goya had initially been encouraged to depict the glorious deeds of the Spanish against the French armies, but the series of 80 prints are a total indictment of war and tyranny. Sane and rational men become little more than savage beasts in a world where human barbarity seems endless. There's nothing noble, Goya seems to be saying, in a struggle where the defenceless are raped, mutilated, executed, and their corpses piled high like a garbage dump. Goya's series of etchings predate war photography by over a century, but many still argue that their power and impact have never been equalled.
Some of the graphic horrors explored and depicted by Goya in The Disasters of War were used for the basis of two extraordinary paintings that in a way are the first war or anti-war oil paintings of the modern era. It begins with this work called The 2nd of May, produced by Goya in 1814, looking back over the events that had taken place 6 years before. And the image starts with a scene where the French troops are sent in to quell a growing mob riot as the mob tries to stop the Spanish royal family from leaving Madrid and effectively leaving them open to French rule. And in a way you'd say this is an heroic image of the heroicism of the people, but actually the central impact of the work is one of chaos and confusion. And then Goya switches gear in this painting, where we're asked to make the narrative leap in our minds, and here there is a tremendously harrowing frozen image of retribution. A day later, and it's actually called the 3rd of May, and the mobsters have been rounded up and they face a firing squad. And you can pick out some of the major protagonists in the previous painting here in this work, with a figure here in the foreground lying in a sticky pool of blood, clearly recognisable as the figure in the right-hand foreground of the 2nd of May stabbing a horse, and the man illuminated facing the firing squad staring unflinchingly at them with the look of horror on his face is also visible as the man stabbing the French soldier who seems to be suspended in thin air in the previous painting. And then we have this amazingly anonymous machine-like firing squad, their backs to us, partly inviting us to look over their shoulders and cast ourselves in the role of aggressors. It's a fantastically staged but claustrophobic image. The hill pushing in on one side, the darkness descending on another, and then this eerie glow from the lantern that illuminates the figure and in a way gives the central image the strongest resonance, because look at the pose of the figure there. Arms out, and look at his palms and you see blood marks, the stigmata, the Christ-like figure, and this is an image of martyrdom. And of course what Goya is doing in these pictures is proclaiming that this is the horrors of war writ large, or painted on the largest scale that Goya can muster. And secondly, and more politically, by 1814, for Spain, the French, and Napoleon in particular, is cast as the Antichrist.
With the war over, Goya came under investigation for his collaboration with the French, as he and other liberals had initially welcomed what they saw as progressive reform. So Goya faced the Inquisition, which had been reinstated by the new despotic king, Ferdinand VII. Although no charges were ever brought against Goya, and he managed to keep his position as a court painter, as well as his annual salary, no further royal commissions ever came his way. And whilst all this was going on, Goya was also struck with a personal loss. In 1812, his wife Josefa died. A few years later, in 1819, now in his mid-70s, Goya bought a small house just outside Madrid called Quinta del Sordo, or the House of the Deaf Man. There he lived with his new companion and housekeeper, Leocadia Weiss, and her daughter. Once again, Goya became seriously ill, but on his recovery,
he started to paint a series of works directly onto the walls of 2 rooms in the house, which are known to us today as the Black Paintings.
This painting seems to have been dug from the depths of Goya's Gothic imagination, but it also has its precedence in classical mythology and in the art of the more recent past. But here, this painting seems to have been dug from the depths of Goya's Gothic imagination, but it also has its precedence in classical mythology and in the art of the more recent past. But here, in Goya's hands, the thing is much more monstrous. The story goes that Saturn was told by Mother Earth that his children would eventually usurp him, and so he bites the heads off each and every one of them to kill them as an act of kind of self-preservation. But here, the image that Goya gives us isn't of a god in control. In fact, he's lost the plot. He's unbalanced and unhinged. And when the work was first painted on the wall of the house of the deaf man, it sported a full erection, an horrendous image of sexual gratification, where Saturn is presented as life-giver as well as life-taker. But either through censorship or when the works were transferred onto canvas and then brought here to the Prado, that was lost. And what we have with this god of melancholy is a dark, brooding, horrific scene that perhaps mirrors something of the pessimism and sense of imprisonment that Goya himself is feeling.
Here, Goya returns to a scene that he'd painted some 32 years earlier, that of San Isidro. But the happy picnickers are now replaced by something much gloomier. The pilgrims cluster together, their mouths gaping wide open on their distorted faces as they try to sing. And suddenly, individual rational beings seem lost in a seething, irrational mass of humanity. With Spain still in ongoing political turmoil, Goya decided to go into exile. He petitioned the king for permission to visit France for reasons of health, and it was given, and so Goya headed to Bordeaux.
And it was while he was living in Bordeaux that Goya produced his last major oil painting, this one, called The Milkmaid of Bordeaux, showing a doughy-eyed, slightly melancholic woman staring off into space with a milk churn on the left-hand side of the picture, on which Goya has scratched his name as an artist of 81. And some people have interpreted this work as a sign that in his old age he's increasingly experimental, and to a certain extent he was. And they say that this work, in its brushstrokes, in its looseness, in this hazy impressionism, anticipates the works of French artists later on in the century. But I think perhaps that's overstating the case. For me, the strongest feeling that you get from this work is nostalgia, but also of a man who's found some kind of peace, harmony and resolution in his life. When I look at it, I'm reminded of the young man who came to Madrid, who made those studies or cartoons for the tapestries of frolics and picnics. And here, if you like, the career's come full circle.
A year after completing The Milkmaid, Goya died in Bordeaux on the 16th of April, 1828. He was 82, but in 1901 his body was returned to Spain and buried in the Hermitage of San Antonio de la Florida in Madrid, the very church where a century earlier he'd painted his frescoes. Goya is a pivotal figure in the history of art, an artist who reinvigorated traditional portraiture and religious devotional imagery. But ultimately it was Goya's unflinching vision that set him apart from almost any other painter in history. That searing, uncompromising gaze that enabled him to see and depict human frailty with an unprecedented directness and power which arguably has never yet been surpassed.